You are watching Life on Gabriola TV, community television, for you, by you.
Thank you so much for that, Brenda. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight with us, to the organizers for the invitation, to Ardith for the opening work, my sister for the opening work, my dad. What a pleasure that is to have my dad. I'm telling you, one of the great honors of my life is being able to serve with my dad in Chief and Council and other capacities for our people. I've learned so much from him and his father, and so it's really nice that you're here. My mom and dad are here tonight with you all. So we're talking about a very big topic in our world tonight, and so I'm honored to share a few thoughts about that. I find it to be, let me first say, I spoke with Sheila earlier today. She texted me this morning and said, I'm so sorry that you and the Premier are on stage at the same time in different places in our region. I'm like, it's just unbelievable the way this has played out. And you know, how campaigns function and how they work, the leadership tour is very kind of last minute and it sort of gets its own energy. And anyways, here we are. The Premier Eby's at Bevan Park tonight talking and with Sheila and others. So Sheila sends her regards. And the Premier sends his apology for booking an event at the same time I have an event. And it's been a great honor of my life and career to be his special counsel on Indigenous Reconciliation. I just want to be crystal clear about the fact that when the writ dropped, we no longer effectively have a Premier as a matter of law in the country and in the province. And that means I'm a special counsel to no one. So my role also fell by the wayside for this election period. So I'm here in my personal capacity with you all tonight. Yay. So let me tell you, Brenda, thank you so much for that introduction. And so wonderful to see people like Catherine and Lisa and others that are here tonight. I want you to know first and foremost how much I love this island. Oh, I love Gabriola. Like Dad was saying, right? Same thing for me when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time over here with my grandparents too, Grandpa fishing, and we go down to Indian Point where the reserve is at the southern end of the island. Spent a lot of time. My Fran is here, Fran Ricalma, my Uncle Howie's wife. My Uncle Howie and my cousins, right? Like they have property over here. We spend lots of time in the summers. This is a very special place to me. Personally, it's a very special place to the Snuneymuxw people, but it's very special to me. When my oldest boys were little boys, we lived on Thompson Road for a period of time. My ex's father, so Ilsa Hill, her father, Dr. Larry Hill, had a property on Thompson Road, and we spent, I think, about a year over here, living here, and I just really enjoyed that time. So it feels like about 3 or 4 lifetimes ago now, but I want to begin with that. And now, Brenda mentioned interesting history about being over here in the 90s and some of the first moments of, I would imagine it was really some of the first moments that the people of Gabriola and the people of Snuneymuxw were really specifically talking about the idea of, hey, where are we at and where should we be? Like, where do we need to get together? And as she mentioned, it was a little bit sometimes difficult conversations. Certainly it was a long time ago. My gosh, that was like, 25 years ago. And I remember some people standing up and speaking in frustration. And like one of the things that came through to me very clearly was a lack of knowledge of each other from that generation. And so I remember standing up, and I just loved this moment. I thought it was so beautiful because I was able to stand up to a number of the people that had stood up and spoken and raised concerns and were being tentative about this whole idea of the Snuneymuxw people and their relationship to Gabriola and the treaty process and what that might possibly mean. And I was able to tell them, I want you to know, sir, and I want you to know, ma'am, that I grew up with your son. I played soccer with him. I grew up with your daughter. She's a cherished friend of mine. And it's important to know that we know each other in ways that we maybe haven't over the past decades and years. And that we love each other. We respect each other. We're friends. And so I hope that, I don't know if anybody remembers that or if anybody was there, but that was really important to me to be able to talk in that way. Because I know that certainly at that time there had been many, many, many years where Snuneymuxw's proper relationship with this part of its territory really had been significantly impacted by colonialism and the passage of time and the terribly small reserve does everybody know about the tiny little reserve on the south end of Gabriola? So the Snuneymuxw people are one of the biggest First Nations in the province, but we have one of the, for whatever reasons of history, one of the tiniest Indian reserve land bases in Canada on a per capita basis. I grew up on a little 40-acre reserve right on the estuary, and then we have some other larger, although not large reserves on the Nanaimo River, but when there's a big rain like there's been right now and big tides, a lot of that goes underwater every winter. So we have very, very little land. And we only have 6 Indian reserves. 2 of them are on or adjacent to Gabriola. One of them is the tiny, I think it's, like 1.5 or 2 acres of land at the south end of Gabriola. And then there's the little burial island out in the middle of Degnan Bay that was set aside as an Indian reserve because it was understood that it was a burial island, but it's very tiny. I'm sure many of you know it there out in the middle, out in front of where you live there. But absolutely important history that we have that my dad spoke to. And I'm happy to be here again tonight to talk about some of that. I'm going to be talking not so much specifically about the Snuneymuxw, Gabriola, and Gabriolans' relationship as much as the broader themes of reconciliation. Brenda also spoke about some of the important work that's happened in the country over the last number of decades, where I've always thought about it as Canada is starting to finally get to a place where the people of Canada need to grab a hold of the reins and shape what this country is and what it needs to be in the future. In a way that in some ways, we haven't always. We're very distinct from the American experience as opposed to Canada. I'm not sure if you know, so the Salish Sea, of course, goes down at the United States, and the whole Coast Salish world is chopped in half by the international border. If you go down to the southern part of the Coast Salish world, you will come across things like Coast Salish courts, with Coast Salish judges applying Coast Salish law, where the sovereignty of the Coast Salish peoples in the American part of the border is not something that's a scary thing. It's not a terrifying thing, the idea that Indigenous peoples have lawmaking power and have decision-making power and have those kinds of rights. It's not something that was terrifying to the Americans. And I think it's a little bit to do with the history of America and the Americans wresting control over their country from the Crown, the British, and saying we as a people collectively hold the sovereignty of what is the United States of America. And so for the Americans, it's a much easier thing for them to imagine that Indigenous peoples must have something similar to what they have. But on the Canadian side, it's been a remarkable 50 years or so. There's a very important, the work that Brenda's done in her career and her partners, Louise Mandel, these are people that have brought about, I want to really acknowledge this, Brenda, the work that you've done. Not many people can stand up and say, I have brought about an entire area of law in the way that Brenda and her partners can say they have done at Mandel Pinder. Like, this is remarkable. Before their work, there was very little substance in Canadian law about Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. Very, very little to work with. They worked tirelessly over decades with the nations that they were working with to bring about an articulation of a whole body of law. Incredible, incredible work and achievement. And now it's been something that has driven the legal work that they've done, has been such an important driver of political developments, where I suppose you could imagine that sometimes on the political side, government side, politicians decide that they either have too narrow of a window in terms of decision-making and governing with election cycles to be able to do big, huge, transformative work, or they don't see the electoral benefit of it, but that there is, and so we did not ever make a lot of progress on that side in and of itself. But with the legal work and the legal imperatives that were laid down and established over decades, it's always been a very important driver of reconciliation in our country, of the political developments. So we have a very important stream of legal work that's been unfolding for decades. We've had very important streams of political work, realizations, like you think about, do you remember in 1969, the year that I was born, then Prime Minister Trudeau and his Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, they put forward an idea in the white paper of 1969 that there should be no distinct rights in this country. The idea that Aboriginal peoples would have different rights than other Canadians is an idea that doesn't work for the way that they envision and imagine this country. And so the white paper of 1969, its very basic core idea was that those rights, that Indians as Indians would cease to exist, that the Indian Act would be erased, and that this idea of Aboriginal and treaty rights would be wiped from the history of Canada, and certainly from the future of Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau called Aboriginal rights historical might-have-beens. So that was quite an incredible statement. And of course, it led to very important political developments on the Aboriginal side. It led to the development of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. It led to the articulation and further development of the Native Indian Brotherhood and the Assembly of First Nations entities. It brought together and coalesced the advocacy of First Nations across the board. So very important impacts. And then we get to Tom Berger. So my father's father, Chief Doug White the First, he was the chief in the 1960s. His cousin Clifford White and our relation David Bob from Snuneymuxw were out hunting in the summer of 1963. They were charged for hunting deer out of season under the Provincial Game Act. And they were convicted at trial. And then Tom Berger was brought in to bring that first major Aboriginal rights case, treaty rights case, all the way through to the Supreme Court of Canada by 1965. So an important part of the political work supporting that very first legal intervention, now remember that from 1927 to 1951, it was prohibited by the Indian Act for First Nations to hire lawyers. That law was dropped by 1951, and by the 1960s, this became the first major case about a decade later. Tom Berger, and I asked him, I had a chance to sit down with him years ago, and I said, I don't know how you did this, but where did that come from, all of the arguments in White and Bob? Because in the first instance, his argument was that there is in fact a treaty, because the Crown's position was that there was no such thing as a Douglas Treaty from 1854 with the Snuneymuxw. So in the first instance, Tom Berger's arguments were, and he brought the provincial archivist Willard Ireland and the provincial anthropologist Wilson Duff to bring the treaty out of the archives and to tell the story of what it meant, that there was in fact a treaty, remarkable work. What he said was that if you disagree with this first line of argument, my secondary argument is then to talk about the Aboriginal title and the Aboriginal rights of the Snuneymuxw people. If you don't agree that there was a treaty, then we're going to talk about Aboriginal title. So it's up to you what you want to talk about. And we won on the treaty side. But one of the other major political, so the two of the main political leaders were Chief Doug White from Snuneymuxw and then late Wilson Bob from Snuneymuxw. They're the ones that really drove this work and this appeal and the support of it. Supporting them was Guy Williams from the Native Brotherhood, it was a fishermen's union on the surface, but it became the incubator of advocacy during that time period from 27 to 51. And they supported the work financially. And one of the other major leaders of the time was Frank Calder. So Frank Calder was a major supporter of the White and Bob appeal and litigation. And then, of course, so Frank Calder and Tom Berger then went on to talk and say, look, we wanted to, maybe we should talk about an Aboriginal title case for the Nisga'a people, which is what they did. Starting in 1969, they had the trial decided by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1973, which is then when Prime Minister Trudeau said, well, I think I might have been wrong about what I said about your rights. And so maybe we do need to get on with the reality of Aboriginal title and Aboriginal rights and start to negotiate those on the political side. And so this opened up in our country very important pathways. I was giving a talk years ago, I don't know how long ago now, at UVic on the Douglas Treaties and at UVic Law School. And I walked into the room to prepare, and I looked over and there's an elderly gentleman sitting there. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I got there early to prepare. It was Frank Calder sitting he was the only person there. I'm like, good Lord, Mr. Calder's here. So my heart started pounding, and I went up to him like, Mr. Calder, I'm so honored that you're here. And he said, oh, I would never miss a talk by my old friend Doug White. He thought it was, he went there to hear a speech from my grandfather. I'm like, I'm so sorry, it's me, I'm Doug White III, and I'm the one giving the talk today. He started laughing, he's like, oh, that's just wonderful, I'm so happy to be here. But there was Frank Calder, a towering figure in our history. When it came to my speech, I'm like, wow, he was there to hear my grandfather. It was so awesome. But all of the sort of confluence of incredible people working hard over decades and generations to bring us to where we're at today, and to shift and to change the politics and the nature of the discussion. And the legal and the political have been so important in this back and forth between them. And so such essential, groundbreaking work that Brenda and her partners and others have done in that time period and continuing to this day. It continues to be critically important. Pushing, articulating the law, driving and pushing the politicians, giving them the courage and the imperatives and the direction they need to do the right work. And then at the same time, in recent decades, there's been very important work in Canadian society about reconciliation. And this too is, in some ways, is born out of the legal system pushing for, and some people from Snuneymuxw as well that were involved in the Alberni residential school and what happened there, leading into the Plint litigation, or the prosecution of Plint, who was in the residential school at Alberni. And that led to other residential school survivors pushing to hold people accountable, ultimately leading to class actions that ultimately led to a settlement in the Truth and Reconciliation. That part of the settlement was the establishment of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this was very hard and important work in our country. You remember, grueling stuff. This is not stuff that we talked about in our homes, in our communities. But why? Because this is painful. Who wants to talk about that stuff? Painful, ugly things happened, and nobody wants to talk about that. And yet here we are, as part of the settlement, establishing a Truth and Reconciliation. We better sit down and talk about and hear what happened, to lay down the truth of what happened and to understand that aspect of our history as a country, and then understand where do we need to go from at this point. I always, when I think about this, I feel that we owe so much to the courage of those survivors that stood up to talk and to share. There was well over 10,000 testimonies across the country of residential school survivors. I've looked and seen other studies of other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in different parts of the planet, one in West Africa, where some psychologists from Ivy League universities went there to that country to say and to inquire into how's everybody doing, having gone through your Truth and Reconciliation process, how is everybody doing in terms of mental health and well-being? And what they found should be pretty obvious and clear to everybody. For the people that were the victims in the horrors of that country, them participating in the process came at great cost as a matter of mental health and well-being. Significant spikes in PTSD, depression, anxiety, all of this. So, I think we have significant responsibilities and obligation to yet another expression of courage of those survivors, the fact that they stood up and talked. Because when they stood up and talked, it came at a great price. It brought up all of that trauma. And that's true, too, of the prosecution of Plint. One of the plaintiffs did not survive through to the sentencing. He committed suicide, having struggled with the things that he talked about and testified to. So as a society, we went through that process, and I think that we owe significant obligations and responsibilities to the survivors to take that work seriously and to make sure that the recommendations that came out of it are part of the fabric of the way that we're building our country going forward. I mean, obviously, we don't ever want to see anything like that happen again, and we don't expect it to. But it did, and it must be addressed, and the harm that took place must be understood and grappled with, and then the directives and the recommendations around reconciliation have to be taken seriously and have to be fully embraced. So that social work there, and then the work also in society about the murdered missing Indigenous women's inquiry, that also was another major dimension of the work as a society of grappling with and understanding. I think all of this together, all of these different streams of work in the legal, the political, and the social side, they all, I think, bring us to a really remarkable moment in our country's history where we have to be grappling with and asking ourselves the most basic and fundamental questions about who we are as a country, and who we are as a society, who we are to each other, and how we want to be, how we want to live in the future. So, remarkable moment, powerful moment. I want to talk a bit about time as chief and the way that I was raised, because this is a time period when we're still in survival mode as people. And so when you're in survival mode, you're sort of trained to fight and to protect. And I grew up, you got to look after your cousins, right? In the school system and in the city and the town. You got to look after each other. You got to look after your people from your nation. Always protecting and fighting. I mean, that was just the mode. I grew up in South Nanaimo as a Aboriginal kid. You grow up fighting. Part of the reason why we love lacrosse is a great training ground for fighting, right, Dad? So you got to have to look after yourself. What an ugly time, right? It was not nice. It was not fun. But you learn about that stuff. When I was younger, my Uncle Hugh Breaker became a lawyer, and that was an inspiration. And when I went to law school, I'm telling you, I went there to learn how to fight. I didn't go there out of some idealistic thing about loving justice. I need to equip myself with the tools I need to protect my people and to fight for them. And so that's why a major part of the reason why I went to law school. And so when I became chief of Snuneymuxw a number of years later, after having spent a couple of years at Mandel Pinder working with Brenda and Louise and Chloe Ostrove and the others, further deepening in my understanding about different ways to work and support and advocate, it was an amazing, eye-opening thing to sit in as the role of chief of Snuneymuxw in that position of responsibility, where it is, to this day, it's the most grueling job or work or role I've ever had in my life. Unbelievable in the way that it can be all-consuming, and where you're responsible for the people that are most vulnerable in this country. Holy man, what a grueling job. I tell this story sometimes about the role and the scope of a First Nations chief. Where you sit with a mayor of a city, or you sit with an MLA or an MP or a minister, you about the scope of the work, what are you engaged in and involved in? I'd say, The most far-reaching role in this country is a First Nation chief and council member, because you're dealing with municipal issues, you're dealing with provincial issues, federal issues, international issues. You deal with the full range of it. And so I tell this story also just to explain the wide scope. I remember this one day, I got a phone call from Snuneymuxw elder. Chief, just calling up, there's something wrong with my toilet. And I was like, holy cow. This is part of my work, right? Someone's toilet is not working, so I got to help them figure out how to sort out their toilet. So I'm talking with them, and I'm like, oh, Mr. So-and-so, we can talk. I'll talk to so-and-so in the maintenance department, and, we'll get this figured out. We'll help you out. But I talked with him for a while. I said, listen, Mister, I've got to get going. I've got to go and do a speech right now. Oh, Chief, where are you at today? Oh, I'm in New York. I'm at the United Nations. I'm about to give a speech. And he's like, oh, my God. Well, Chief, I better let you go then. You go. You have a... And that's it, right? It's everything from the toilet on the reserve that's not working to giving a speech at the United Nations about the doctrine of discovery. And so, holy man, it's amazing. I don't think there's any wider scope than that, is there? Oh my gosh. So it was a grueling time, right? And I showed up and I started deploying everything that I learned and known and been raised and trained about. I sat down with my dad and other members of council, and I said, let's talk and figure out what we need to do to fundamentally change and transform the position of Snuneymuxw. Because, we're one of the largest First Nations in the province, but we had so little land. We had no economic development of any meaningful kind going on. We had like a little corner store that sold chips and pop and I don't know what else, but, that was it. We were in a very bad position. And I said, look, and also, I had to contend with the cruise ship terminal proposal from the Port Authority, and these other sort of immediate things that came up that I had to start grappling with. And I said, we need to sit down, and we can't always be in a reactionary mode. We've got to figure out a strategy about how to shift the reality we're in right now to something fundamentally different. So let's talk. We went off for a few days and talked. And by the end of it, we had settled on this, notwithstanding the fact that the Douglas Treaty rights that we held were utterly disrespected and denied by both Canada, British Columbia, the Port Authority, the city. Nobody had any regard or respect for our Douglas Treaty rights. Nonetheless, they are the most powerful legal rights that exist of any Indigenous people in this country. Remarkable. The incredible work in Saanich Bay Marina in Claxton that you guys did. There was a proposal for a marina to be built in Tsayout's fishery area. And the province had given a license of occupation to the marina proponent to build a marina in the middle of this crab fishery, shell fishery, everything. Of course, well, why not? No such thing as a treaty, right? Doesn't matter. The White and Bob decision from 1965 doesn't matter. And so Louise and Brenda and others, I can't remember who was all involved in that, Chloe, worked with the Tsayout, articulated and fought, and ultimately won the decision. And the Court of Appeal said that the province has no constitutional capacity or authority to approve anything that would interfere with the continuity of the Douglas Treaty rights of the Tsayout people. Like, as a matter of law, the treaties push back provincial jurisdiction. Holy man, this is unbelievable. What a powerful decision. Terrifying to the provincial government, the idea that their jurisdiction would be interfered with in such a way. And so we use decisions like that and others, the White and Bob decision, the Claxton, others, to start to build a strategy. And we settled on the Douglas Treaties as the tool that we would use to change the situation that we were in. And we embarked and we deployed that strategy very effectively. Got into big fights with the Nanaimo Port Authority, got into big fights with the province, We were fighting over things like docks, dock approvals that no one had ever given any time to in the past. We said, look, as long as our fisheries rights are being disregarded, there will be no decisions allowed that interfere with our fishery. And just sort of started paralyzing provincial decision-making. Got the province's attention, right? Like, how do you change, how do you animate and move? Well, in that context, we were effectively putting our foot on the throat of the province to get them to pay attention, to do something. And we were, very successful. By 2013, we were signing a reconciliation agreement that quadrupled the land base of Snuneymuxw. Unbelievable. And by 2013, we were very good friends with the mayor of Nanaimo. Remember? Yeah, it was like, holy cow, how did this... We went from total disregard and disrespect to really working in meaningful partnership. But something happened too on that day in 2013. I think it was in April 2013, if I remember correctly, when we were signing the reconciliation agreement. Very historic day in Nanaimo, for the people of Nanaimo, for the Nanaimo for sure, for the province, to take this step of entering into a new relationship. But on that day, the Nanaimo Daily Free Press decided to publish the most ugly racist letter to the editor. It was very specifically targeted to rain on the parade of the reconciliation agreement. And it said things like, the Indians have never contributed a goddamn thing to civilization or society in any way at all. Useless, don't have anything to offer, blah, 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 blah. And I remember reading it, I can remember the feeling, it was like being punched in the stomach, right? Those words were meant to hurt, and they did hurt. And my late grandmother, Ellen White, my dad's mom, always said, you be careful with how you talk, my grandson. And she would say this to all of us. Words are very powerful. You be careful with them. They can hurt. And for me, what hurt me the most that morning when I read that was I knew that my grandmother would do what she did every single day. She would start her day by reading the newspaper, and she would see that letter. She would read it. That made me feel sick to my stomach. So what happened? The next day, gathered up, got the Snuneymuxw together, got our allies, our relations on the island together, went to the parking lot of the Free Press to protest, to stand there and give speeches and wave our arms around and say, this is not right. For me, what was most important about that response was not that the Snuneymuxw were there, of course we were there, or our close relations. They were there too. But so too were some more distant Aboriginal leadership and people. So too then was the national chief, Ottenshut, Sean Atleo, was there, came from Vancouver to be there. What was most important to me was that the mayor of Nanaimo was standing with us, and the councillors and the regional district members, MLAs and MPs. Most importantly, the people of Nanaimo were there. Half the crowd were the citizens of Nanaimo, standing there. And one of my good friends, Julie Chadwick, who wrote for the paper, and Cara McKenna, they came out from the office and said, we're so sorry, this is just so embarrassing. We don't know what to do or say. We just wanted to tell you that we're so upset. And she told me later, she said, so in the office at the Daily Free Press, while you guys are outside singing and giving speeches, she said the editor of the Daily Free Press is running around the office saying, this is a very dangerous situation. Everyone, you get in your offices and you lock the doors. And she said to him, what are you, crazy? My parents are out there. This isn't dangerous. Her own parents were out, part of the crew, protesting. And so it really, that whole experience and what it was about, we hold We held, with VIU, Ralph Nilsson and others worked with us to hold community forums about racism and yada, yada, yada. But it made me really think about the work and what is the work and what mode do we have to be in. Because I realized that, somewhere in all of that mix came a big realization for me. And that was, I might be able to make certain progress for my people in the mode that I've been working in, which is fighting. Bare-knuckled sort of fighting. But I realized I would never be able to bring about the world I want for my children and grandchildren in that mode. Wouldn't be possible. And I thought too, I remembered about, do you remember when the Chief Justice of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, and he was either he was a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, he was a judge. He might have been a senator by this point, I can't remember, but after the TRC was done, they stood up and gave a talk about the work of the TRC. And one of the comments, one of the main themes of what Justice Beverly McLaughlin talked about was the need for more tolerance in Canadian society. And I really agreed with that. I mean, I thought that was a very important thing that she talked about. But at the same time, it's sort of a frame of, it's an outcome of fighting, and when you're fighting, how do we move beyond fighting? It's kind of, tolerance is about moving to each other's corners and stop hurting each other. Okay, that's, good God, that's important. Yes, we can get behind that. Let's do that. But one thing I learned too is that tolerance amounts to acceptance without concern. So I accept that you exist, but I'm not concerned about you or your well-being. I'm not going to hurt you, but I don't care about you. Then I learned what a different frame, one of altruistic love. And what is that kind of a relationship? That's both acceptance and concern. I care about your well-being. I'm invested in, and I have imperatives, and I have obligations and responsibilities towards you and your well-being. I love you in an altruistic way. My heart and my mind are turned toward you. And so I thought, in all of this, thinking about what do I want for my children and grandchildren, for all of our children and grandchildren. I want my children to be loved by other Canadians, not merely tolerated, but I want them to be loved by other Canadians. And I want Canadians to love them. I want them to be in loving relationships. And so this is where, so for me, it started to be a really important shift in the way that I thought about my work and the nature of the work. Sometimes fighting might be necessary, whatever, but the main mode you have to be in is reaching out and understanding the totality of the moment that we're in as a broad society, one where we're asking ourselves fundamental questions about who we are individually, but also who are we to each other and how do we want to live together in the future. And so it really did start to take more opportunities in terms of public engagement and public speeches and talking, with the idea that we need to find ways to know each other better, more deeply, more meaningfully. In the way that I talked about the fact that I grew up with kids from Gabriola. My sister Tracy, I mean, come on, tell me. Some of the best people, some of the best kids are from Gabriola kids. Oh my God. So much fun, such wonderful people, right? That's the stuff that we want to prevail, not the lack of knowledge or relationship with each other. So in my work, I continued as working as a lawyer, as a negotiator, across the country in Northern Ontario to do with the Ring of Fire work, in Northern British Columbia with the Lake Babine Nation. Very proud of that work with the Lake Babine people. And this is, Brenda referenced the treaty process that began a long time ago, that Snuneymuxw was a part of a long time ago. The original thought of the treaty process, I was called as a witness at the beginning of the treaty process in Squamish, where the Prime Minister, Mulroney, Premier Harcourt, and First Nations leadership were all together at Squamish to launch the BC Treaty process. And I remember Chief Joe Mathias, what he spoke about on that day. He said, "The era of extinguishment is over. We are now moving into a period of the recognition and implementation of our rights." That's what we believe we were doing on the First Nations side and bringing that process about and creating that process. The hard work of those great leaders like Joe Mathias, late George Watts, so many of these people that are gone now that spent their entire lives working to build that opportunity. It became really clear on the, I don't know, like it was just a handful of years where it started to become clear that that's actually not what BC and Canada were arriving to do. They just wanted more effectively extinguishment. You set aside your Aboriginal title, you set aside your Aboriginal rights, and you take what's in the paper. The paper will be the basis of your rights going forward. And that's why the treaty process has never properly worked in the way that it was intended in this country or in this province. It worked in some very unique spots, Tsawwassen, Kla'amin, Maltnuth, but it has not worked across the board. And then now over the past 30 years, the law continues to develop, and one of the most important and historic decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada in 2014, in the Chilcotin Nation Aboriginal title decision, the court finally made a decision and a declaration of title. The Aboriginal title can live and breathe and be recognized and can be part of the fabric of the province. And so, and that's about recognition and implementation of an Aboriginal title, of an Aboriginal right, not asking anyone to set it aside or to take fee simple land in its place or anything like that. And then at the same time around then too, Canada and British Columbia were starting to turn towards, or Canada in particular, was starting to turn towards the recognition and implementation and adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a very interesting document. And I don't know why, I'm not quite sure why it scares so many people in the world, but it has two basic ideas to it. There's two basic theoretical frames to it. On the one hand, there's the decolonization framework that was born out of the work of the North American Indigenous peoples primarily that led the UN, the development of the UN Declaration. And then as it became more global in its breadth and its work, particularly South American and African Indigenous peoples, for them, they were less interested in decolonization and a sharper priority for them was human rights in the Indigenous context. And so those are the two main things, decolonization and human rights. And on the decolonization side, it simply talks about that Indigenous peoples have a right of self-determination and that Indigenous peoples have a relationship with land, with their territory. The same things that we've been talking about in the BC Indian land question for over a century. That's all our people have been advocating for, is to have a say and to have a relationship with the land. And so the UN Declaration and that where Canada finally endorsed it shortly after the Chilcotin decision, I think 2016, all of this starts pushing us and propelling us into more innovative spaces together that are much more about respect and recognition of inherent rights and their implementation, rather than the Crown constantly feeling like it has to be an ultimate control over everything. So it's a very important switch, and for whatever reason, and Brenda could speak better to this than I, the idea that Aboriginal people should have a say continues to be one of the scariest ideas for the Canadian imagination. I don't know why. For some reason, it's like the boogeyman of Canada. And if you look at the whole body of Canadian Aboriginal law, you'll see that there's basically a big smoking hole in the middle of it. It's got, treaty rights are sorted out, Aboriginal titles sorted, all this stuff, the decision-making infrastructure and consultation, and yada, yada. All of these things have been developed, but really at the core, there's a big missing part, and that is the right of self-determination and self-government. Even in the Chilcotin Nation decision, the Supreme Court, as recently as 2014, still really skirted around the issue. And they sort of framed the Aboriginal title, they leaned more towards private property than about a state's relationship with territory, which comes with the jurisdiction and all of that, decision-making about the landscape. But we've been taking steps in recent years, I think in part because of the lack of progress in the treaty process. First Nations, and particularly the province, have said, well, look, we can't just not make progress. Like, the core issues that the treaty process was aimed at continue to be there. And if we don't make progress in some way, we're going to continue to be stuck in the mud in conflict. And so the province and First Nations really started to develop more and more bilateral pathways of agreements in different sectors on different topics. And then ultimately on things like the Lake Babine Reconciliation Agreement, which is a broad and wide-ranging agreement, both about Aboriginal title and also self-determination. And it's an incremental, slowly and carefully built approach that will unfold over the course of a number of years. Other things that were important about, so there's the UN Declaration. BC passed the Declaration, the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in 2019. Canada passed one, I think, in 2021, if I remember, about implementing the UN Declaration in the Canadian context. Has been very important work. We've got the Declaration Act Secretariat in BC doing very important work about, in particular, the alignment of laws. You have to understand, how like the body of provincial law is thousands of pages of laws. By far the majority of them, although that's changed in the last few years, are all written with the idea that Aboriginal title doesn't matter, doesn't exist. That Aboriginal peoples don't matter, they don't have decision-making power, it's immaterial to this body of law. And so part of the commitment of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act is about realigning the laws of British Columbia to make sure that they're compliant with the UN Declaration, which just means compliant with the reality of Indigenous peoples' rights. So that's been very important work. In addition to that, there have been the articulation of what are called civil litigation directives. I don't want to get too technical here, but basically the federal attorney general, Jody Wilson-Raybould, on her very last day in office, put forward the product of multiple years of her work, a civil litigation directive, which told federal lawyers to litigate differently and in different ways, to shape their discretion in new ways in terms of litigation with Aboriginal litigants. And then the province followed suit. Attorney General David Eby, a year or two later, did the same thing provincially. Now, because I say that because I want to talk about the Haida title work. That there's things I can talk about and things I can't talk about. But I just want to simply say that there's been long-standing litigation, I think goes back to 2002, that the Haida brought for a declaration of Aboriginal title over Haida Gwaii. And one of the key elements of the civil litigation directive is to direct government as a whole to find ways to settle litigation rather than go through a litigation process. One of the challenges of the Chilcotin Aboriginal title decision is that nobody was ready for it. There had been no work done on a government-to-government basis in relation to that outcome because the outcome was utterly in the hands of a judge. And no one knew what they would say or what they wouldn't say. And so you can't prepare. And so even today, although lots of really good work has been done by the Chilcotin in BC, I wouldn't call it a quagmire, but it's a difficult space to work in because none of the work had been done on a government-to-government basis. And so a number of years ago now, there was a very important decision in relation to the Haida to try to figure out if there was a space to negotiate on a government-to-government basis resolution of at least a component of the overall Haida title litigation. The Haida title litigation includes the ocean spaces and the fisheries. We only resolved the land component of the Haida title litigation. But as Brenda said, this was like very important and innovative work that was done in a way that it did a number of things. It confirmed the continuity of the fee simple interests where they exist on Haida Gwaii. So 2% of the landscape of Haida Gwaii is held in fee simple. Half of it by Mosaic in 10,000 hectares of forest lands that they own in the middle of the Northern Island, and the other 10,000 hectares in the various villages and communities in Haida Gwaii. Very clearly protects, and it's the Haida people saying we acknowledge and we respect the fee simple interests and their continuity. And we respect and we continue the fact that the province has jurisdiction over the municipalities and local government issues on Haida Gwaii. So it amounts to, and it takes place in a very unique part of the province, but it's a very unique and innovative approach to dealing with the complexities of what we called the BC Indian land question for a century in a new way, in a way where we have the Indigenous people and the Crown working in tight partnership and together for the benefit of everyone in the province. And so that was a remarkable outcome, and one that, it's the product of generations of work. So really honored to be a part of that work in the little ways that I can. Can I just do a quick time check? I don't know how long I've talked for.
7:31.
What does that mean about how much time I have? Because I don't know when I started. All night. Wasn't my ferry at 8? What time did you say it is? 7:30?
There's one at 9:40.
Oh my gosh, 9:40. So I have 2 more hours to speak is what you're telling me. Nobody wants that.
The question and answer period.
Yes, Q&A.
But there's chubas.
Nice. Yes, the Nanaimo bars, I love it. I wanted to talk about the BC First Nations Justice Council work because it's such important work and so interesting. Maybe I'll just talk about it briefly. This is work that I got involved in a number of years ago, I think 2016 or so, where I was asked to be part of the First Nations Justice Council, and when I got into the work, I said, let me take on the criminal justice part. I'll work with the province and see what we can come up with. I said, give me 6 months, I'll try to come up with something. And that's how I started working with David Eby, because he was the Attorney General at the time. And so really engaged with him and started working. And we got to an MOU in September 2017, which said we would create and develop a BC First Nations justice strategy over the next 2 years. And at that time, we also agreed that we would start to act. And this is why I have so much respect for him. And don't take this in a campaigny election kind of way. But the only reason I'm working I have been working as Special Counsel for the Premier is because of this time and this work with him, where I really got to know him and his values and the way that he approaches the work, because there was incredible alignment, I thought, with the way that I also approach the work. And one of the keys is that we always must be finding ways that we can act to make a difference in people's lives. So let's not just sit around and talk about strategies for 2 years. While we're doing that, let's make sure that we're doing things that matter and can make a difference. And so we agreed then that we would start to support the work of GLADU report writing in the province, which is it's specialized sentencing reports for Aboriginal offenders, that they should be sentenced differently. This is direction that came from the federal parliament and from the Supreme Court of Canada. In the criminal code, it said, judges, you must take into consideration the background factors of Indigenous offenders and what they've experienced, and understand that in context when you're sentencing them. And you must, so it's a different approach. But that is work that had never been properly implemented anywhere in the country. When Parliament acted in the mid-90s to change the criminal code, to give that direction, they talked about the crisis in Canada and Canadian society of overrepresentation of Aboriginal peoples incarcerated. And back then, in the mid-90s, it was about 10.5% of jails in the country were Aboriginal people, which was twice the population, the representative population of Aboriginal peoples. So a real crisis and really embarrassing, and time to act. By the time I got involved 2 decades later, does anybody know what the percentage of incarcerated people are Aboriginal in this country? It's now well over 30%. So every decade that went by, we went from 10% when it's a crisis We gave direction to the judiciary and the criminal justice system to behave differently. Instead of it getting better, every decade that went by added 10% more to the jails. And part of the reason is that there was never a proper implementation of GLADU across the province. So we agreed we would start to find ways to support the development of those reports. We also agreed that we would support the development of 15 Indigenous justice centers across the province that would be focused on assisting Aboriginal peoples that are grappling with the criminal justice system. And so then we started that work, and then we got to the strategy itself. I remember this key meeting we had with the Attorney General David Eby and the Solicitor General Mike Farnworth, and we had the Leadership Council of BC and the Justice Council. What we talked about, I said to them, if we're being serious about things like the UN Declaration, and we're in this meeting at the legislature where we could look out a window and see the United States to the south, Olympic Peninsula and whatnot. And I brought this book with me, a textbook on American Indian criminal jurisdiction and courts. And I said, you know that right there on the southern part of the Coast Salish world, there's Aboriginal, as I was talking about earlier, that's a reality there. And if we're being serious here in this work in articulating a new justice strategy in BC, then we have to address the reality of the self-determination of Aboriginal peoples with respect to the justice system. They agreed. Remarkable. I was astonished. And so we have one main track, and the strategy is about changing the existing system to make it less harmful and more appropriate for Aboriginal peoples. And also the second major track is in place where over the longer term, we will work and support Aboriginal peoples in re-articulating their own systems of justice in the long term. Obviously a lot of work there and much work to be done, but nonetheless, we've got the government and the Crown working with First Nations in the province to say that this is a reality that we want to get to at some point. So really amazing, important work that I poured my, life into over the course of many, many years. That was one of the most difficult things for me to walk away from when I became special counsel. But so, there's enormous opportunity for all of us as a people, as Canadians, as a broader society. I had such a nice conversation with, I can't remember her name now, but the regional district representative. And before that, Vanessa. And then the Islands Trust representative, Toby, right? I first met Sheila Malcolmson when she was in your role, and we were at Snuneymuxw, right, and doing that work, coming over and talking and talking and talking. I think that there is enormous opportunity for First Nations communities and the communities that live around them to work together in new ways that are really premised on recognizing the opportunity of living in respect and recognition. I told a story earlier at dinner about water rights in Nanaimo and access to water, and how I was astonished to realize that a major reserve of my people did not have access to proper water, that their wells had been shut down a quarter of a century earlier because of contamination. It's right adjacent to the regional district landfill in Cedar. And when I was first chief, I remember looking at the budget, and I asked the staff, I'm like, what in God's name is this number? What is this money for this water company? And they told me the story. They said, well, the wells were shut down a quarter of a century ago, and we have a cistern system. We have to buy water from a company to fill up the cistern, and that's how the reserve has water. I said, I don't understand. Is that how much you pay every year? They said, no, that's every quarter. And I was like, oh my God, we could be building our own water system for this money. And so we worked with the city, right? The city wanted a water treatment facility in the mountains. And somehow we'd been left in the dust. But when we showed up, sat down with Mayor Rattan, and I said to the mayor, look, I need help, Mayor. I'm struggling with understanding how this agreement where the Nanaimo supports your water treatment facility to be located on Crown land in the mountains, I don't see how it benefits my people. I need your help, and can you please explain it to me? That's the only time I've ever seen Mayor Rattan kind of mad. He was like, and it was sort of an outcome of kind of embarrassment and kind of shame or humiliation, because there was no benefit for Snuneymuxw. And I said to him, well, look, I mean, I'm so sorry, but this just doesn't work for me. We're going to have to talk about this. And so, we talk. I find out that for that 25 years and longer, there's been a massive city water main going right beside the Indian Reserve, bringing water out to Duke Point for that entire time period. And I'm like, I'm so lost here. Is it the 21st century or where am I? And are we in northern Manitoba, hundreds of miles from any water infrastructure, or are we in downtown Nanaimo, surrounded by one of the most sophisticated developed cities in British Columbia? And you know what that comes from, where that comes from? It's not just, one of the outcomes of the history of colonialism is the idea that we don't matter to each other. The regional district people, the city people, they're like, the infrastructure of the Nanaimo Indian Reserve doesn't even come to mind for us because it doesn't belong to us. That's a federal issue. Why should we ever think about that or care about it? It's not our responsibility. It's not our jurisdiction. It doesn't matter to us. And yet here we are, people that have been living beside each other for well over 100 years. And some of them are like they're in northern Manitoba, far removed from any water system. When the reality is that the city has a goddamn massive water main going right down the road, adjacent to the reserve. And so Mayor Rattan, to his credit, he's like, we're going to fix this. And he spent the money, and he pushed through the decisions to say that we are going to make sure that this reserve has access, and they ran water across that reserve. And I remember, does anybody here remember Mayor Bill McKay? Interesting character. But he got up and spoke. We had a key meeting between the Snuneymuxw and the City of Nanaimo Council. We used to have these dinners and meetings where we would talk. And McKay got up and stood up. It was like sort of a retirement kind of thing. That Rattan his time was finished. And he said, I want everyone to know that when I think this with all of my heart, like when I think about Mayor Rattan and his contributions, all of the work that he's done in this city over his time as mayor, that when history's written about his time as mayor, the singular accomplishment, the singular action that he took, step that he took, that will be remembered as being of historic significance and importance is the fact of the work that he did with Nanaimo and water. That he made that decision to make sure that we were working together to supply water to the reserve. So there's enormous opportunity, both for the Snuneymuxw and the Gabrielans, and for Snuneymuxw and the city and the regional district, and to address and to really look, what are all the manifestations and the implications of the idea that we don't matter to each other, and how can we address them today? How can we have richer lives together? If you ever want to be inspired by sort of a vision for what could be, I want you to look up the Laurier Memorial from the Interior Nations from 1910, 1911. It's one of the most beautiful things you've ever read. It was the chiefs of those people talking about what it means that other people have come to live with them in their lands. They said they seem to be here and they seem to be staying. And they said, what does that mean for us? How should we address that? Well, we should treat them as brothers and as sisters then, if they're going to live here with us in our lands. And there's the most beautiful phrase towards the end. They talk about sharing together. But they say we want to be able to live in a way where we hold each other up and where we make each other great and good. Oh, God, it's just takes your breath away. You have to read it. I don't give it justice the way that I just shared it with you. But when you read that and think about the potential, what could have been if people really heard what those people were saying in terms of a vision for the future, what it could have meant for our province, for those people, for all British Columbians, all Canadians. And I truly think that that's the kind of moment that we're in now, where we have the opportunity and the imperative and the obligation to imagine together those kinds of things, to talk to each other in that way, to sit down and really have a beautiful dialogue. You know, those kinds of conversations where you're a different person from when you sat down and started talking and engaging with someone, that through that conversation, you know you have been changed. You're a different human being by the end of it. Those are the kinds of conversations that I think we should be having. Looking at each other and really seeing each other. Not from the fighting mode that I used to be in and that I will be in again if I need to be, but not in that mode. I don't want to be in that mode. I want to be in one that's premised on the idea of love and acceptance and concern, right? My heart and my mind is turned towards each of you and your well-being, how you are, what kind of a relationship are we in, and how can we always be finding ways to do better. And that's what I want for my children and for my grandchildren. That's what I want for all of you, for all of our children and grandchildren together. I want them to love each other, to be wrapped up in each other, to be concerned about each other's well-being. So that's the vision that I hold in my heart. I wanted to share that with you. It's a very personal thing. Don't want to sound too ridiculous or Pollyannish or anything like that, but it's truly what's in my heart about how I approach my work. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to be with you and share with you a few of those thoughts. So thank you to Brenda and to Ardith, to Tracy, my father, the committees and all of the people that supported this, the beautiful cooks, Lorna. What's the name of the person that made the soup? Dave? Oh, Dave. Hold my hands up to you. That's some beautiful soup. That's some good soup. Wow. And that's a beautiful thing, right? I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how many beautiful conversations I had sitting there, sharing a meal and talking with different people. I'm grateful for that. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, tonight for this opportunity to be with you. Hait seepka. Hait seepka siyama stimo. Thank you. Good? Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.